Wild West love stories. Tales of passion, written on the American frontier.
The world was teeth and ice. Jedediah Vance's face, framed by a frost-caked beard, was crueler than any winter. He loomed over Eleonora, his shadow a stain on the snow-blasted landscape. "You thought you could run," he snarled, his voice a gravelly tear in the fabric of the blizzard. "With my brother's sons? With what's mine?" Nora clutched her swollen belly, the movement a desperate, protective instinct. "They are not yours, Jedediah, and there's nothing left for you." His laugh was a crack of frozen timber. He ripped a small, worn blanket from her pack, the last gift from her mother. "The map, Nora. I know it's there. You'll give it to me, or you'll give your last breath to this storm." He saw the flicker of defiance in her eyes and shoved her backward. She fell hard, the impact stealing the air from her lungs. The world spun in a vortex of white. The last thing she heard was the crack of a whip and the thunder of the wagon fading into the howling wind, abandoning her to a frozen grave. But as the darkness closed in, a pain, sharp and searing, ripped through her, not from the fall, but from within. A life, two lives, were fighting their way into a world that had already left them for dead. What happens when a woman is forsaken by man, but found by a warrior sworn to hate her? Stay with us, and you'll witness a love born from the ashes of betrayal. Like, share, and subscribe to Wild West Love Stories, because the greatest tales are found in the most unforgiving lands. Part 1. A Whisper in the Blizzard. The silence Jedediah left behind was heavier than the snow. It pressed down on Eleonora, a physical weight that threatened to crush what little spirit she had left. The wind was a living thing, a predator that clawed at her thin dress and whispered promises of a quick, cold end. Her hands, numb and clumsy, fumbled to pull the threadbare shawl tighter, a futile gesture against the biting cold. He left me. He left us. The thought was a shard of ice in her heart. This wasn't a stranger. This was Jedediah, the brother of her late husband, the man who had promised to protect her after Jacob's death. That promise had curdled into possession, his grief twisting into a greedy, obsessive hunt for the silver mine Jacob had found, a secret now stitched into the lining of a baby blanket he thought he'd stolen. But Nora had cleverly hidden the real one. The one he took was a decoy. Now, that secret was all she had, a curse and a hope sewn together with linen thread. Another contraction seized her, a brutal clenching that forced a strangled cry from her lips. It was a sound of pure agony, instantly devoured by the storm. This couldn't be happening. Not here. Not now. Panic, cold and sharp, tried to rise, but something fiercer pushed it back down. A primal resolve. She crawled, dragging her heavy body through the deepening snow, her fingers clawing at the frozen earth until they found the hollow of a great, fallen ponderosa pine. It wasn't a home, but it was a shield. Huddled within the curve of the ancient wood, she fought. She fought the pain, she fought the cold, and she fought the encroaching darkness that promised peace. Hours bled into a timeless eternity of pain and prayer. She tore strips from her petticoat with her teeth, her mind focused on a single, burning purpose. You will live. You will not die here. She wasn't just Nora anymore. She was a vessel, a fortress, a mother. The first cry, thin and fragile against the gale, pierced the night just after midnight. Nathaniel. Minutes later, his brother Samuel followed. Tiny, slick, and impossibly alive. She pulled them to her bare chest, their sudden warmth a shocking miracle against her freezing skin. She wrapped them in the last dry pieces of her shawl, their small bodies trembling. "I've got you," she whispered, her voice cracked and raw. "Mama's got you." And then, her strength finally gave out. Her eyes fluttered, the world dissolving into a merciful black. Miles away, a shadow detached itself from the trees. Kiyani moved with a grace that belied the harsh terrain, his moccasins making no sound on the fresh snow. He had been tracking the wagon for 2 days, not for its occupants, but for its trespass. They had used a sacred watering hole, leaving behind the refuse of their world and the scent of arrogance. He was the guardian of this land, a silent sentinel whose heart had been hardened into stone. He carried the memory of another fire, another winter, when blue-coated soldiers had swept through his village. He could still hear his mother's screams, still see the flames devouring his home, still feel the phantom weight of his little brother's hand slipping from his grasp. That day, he had made a vow over the ashes of his world. He would never again lift a hand to help the invaders. He would watch them suffer as his people had suffered. He had seen Jedediah shove the woman down. He had seen the wagon leave her. "Let the storm take her," a cold voice in his soul whispered. "It is justice." He had turned to go, his jaw set, his vow a shield around his heart. But then he heard it, a sound that cut through the wind and his own cold fury. It wasn't the woman's cry of pain, but something else. A thin, reedy wail. The sound of new life, unknowing and pure. He froze, his body rigid. It couldn't be. The sound came again, impossibly small, impossibly brave against the rage of the blizzard. It clawed at him, bypassing the warrior and striking at something deeper, something he thought had died in the fire. He cursed, the word a plume of white in the air. The vow screamed in his mind, but the crying of a child. That was a law older than any vow. His feet, against every command of his own broken heart, turned back toward the hollow log. When Nora's eyes flickered open, it was to the sight of a man's silhouette against the swirling snow. For a terrifying second, she thought Jedediah had come back. A weak, guttural sound of protest formed in her throat as she tried to shield her sons with a body that had no strength left. But this was not Jedediah. This man was taller, broader, and moved with the coiled stillness of a panther. His face was a mask of hard angles and old sorrows, framed by 2 long, black braids. A jagged scar ran from his temple to his jaw, a white line against his bronze skin. His eyes, dark and unreadable, held no cruelty, but also no pity. They were the eyes of a man who had seen too much of the world's ugliness to be surprised by it. He knelt, his movements economical and precise. He didn't look at her, not at first. His gaze went straight to the 2 tiny bundles nestled against her. He saw the faint blue tinge to their lips, the shallow, rapid breaths. "Please," Nora whispered, the word a ghost of a sound. "My boys." Sevens. Kiyani didn't answer in her tongue. He spoke softly in Comanche, his voice low and rough, not to her, but to the spirits of the unforgiving land. "Not for her," he murmured, his breath misting in the frigid air. "For the ones who have not yet learned to hate." His hands, calloused and sure, reached into a leather satchel at his side. He pulled out a waterskin and a thick, oiled hide blanket. He worked with a detached efficiency that was both terrifying and reassuring. He first took a small amount of water on his finger and moistened each baby's lips, his touch surprisingly gentle. Then, he carefully unwrapped them from Nora's damp rags and swaddled them together in the heavy hide, creating a warm, secure cocoon. Nora whimpered, a primal fear rising as he handled her children, but she was too weak to resist. She could only watch as this stranger, this warrior sworn to be her enemy, tended to her sons with a practiced care that spoke of a life that had known both birth and death intimately. Once the babies were secure, he turned his attention to her. His assessment was swift and clinical. He saw the bloodstain on her dress, the feverish glint in her eyes, the exhaustion that was pulling her under. Without a word, he slid one powerful arm under her back and the other beneath her knees, lifting her as if she weighed no more than a child. A jolt of pain and shock went through her, but she didn't cry out. She was too far gone, adrift on a sea of cold and pain. She felt the solid strength of his chest, smelled the scent of pine smoke, leather, and the clean cold of the mountains that clung to him. He carried them away from the hollow log, his steps steady and sure-footed in the treacherous snow. Nora's head lolled against his shoulder, her consciousness fading in and out. She was vaguely aware of the rhythmic crunch of his moccasins, the swaying motion, the muffled sound of his horse whickering nearby. She saw the world in fragments. The dark, imposing shapes of the pine trees, the endless swirl of snowflakes, the stone-like set of his jaw. There was no comfort in his embrace, only a grim, undeniable purpose. He was not a savior. He was a force of nature, as wild and unpredictable as the storm itself. The journey was a blur. She didn't know if it lasted hours or an eternity. But finally, a new scent broke through the frozen air. Wood smoke, roasting meat, and the smell of many people. A soft, orange glow flickered in the distance. The camp. As Kiyani strode into the circle of light, figures emerged from the hide lodges, their faces lit by the central fire. Voices rose, sharp and questioning in a language she didn't understand. She felt the weight of their stares, 100 dark eyes filled with suspicion, hostility, and shock. She was the enemy, a ghost brought in from the storm, a harbinger of the violent world that existed beyond their lands. She saw a young warrior step forward, his hand on the knife at his belt, his face a mask of anger. This was Chaitin, though she didn't know his name yet. He spat words at Kiyani, sharp and accusatory. Kiyani didn't flinch. He simply tightened his grip on Nora and the babies, his gaze sweeping over the crowd, daring any to challenge him. He carried her to a small, isolated lodge at the edge of the camp, pushed aside the hide flap, and laid her down gently on a bed of soft furs. The warmth inside was a shock to her system, a sudden, overwhelming comfort that made her want to weep. He placed the bundled twins beside her. For a moment, he stood over them, a giant of a man casting a long shadow in the firelight. Then, without a word, he turned and was gone, leaving Nora and her sons alone in the heart of a strange, new, and dangerous world. Part 2. The Shadow of the Falcon. Nora awoke to silence. Not the roaring, wind-torn silence of the blizzard, but a deep, muffled quiet, punctuated by the soft crackle of embers in a central fire pit. For a moment, confusion reigned. The world she remembered was ice and agony. This world was warm and smelled of earth and smoked leather. A weak, gray light filtered through the sewn seams of the teepee, illuminating the dome-like space. She was lying on a thick pallet of buffalo and deer hides, softer than any bed she had ever known. A wave of panic seized her as she remembered. The boys! She pushed herself up, her muscles screaming in protest, and there they were. Tucked beside her, swaddled in the warrior's hide, Samuel and Nathaniel were breathing deeply, their tiny chests rising and falling in perfect rhythm. Their cheeks were flushed with warmth, not fever. They were safe. The realization broke over her, and tears of relief, fear, and utter exhaustion traced silent paths down her cheeks. She was alive. They were alive. The hide flap of the lodge was pushed aside, and Nora flinched, instinctively pulling the furs up to cover her sons. An old woman entered, moving with a slow, deliberate grace. Her face was a beautiful map of wrinkles, her long braids shot through with silver. She carried a wooden bowl that steamed gently, filling the lodge with the savory aroma of corn and herbs. This was Tiva. She said nothing, her dark eyes holding a wisdom that was ancient and unreadable. She placed the bowl and a spoon carved from bone on the ground beside Nora's pallet. Her gaze lingered for a moment on the sleeping twins, and a flicker of something, not warmth, but perhaps a deep, sorrowful understanding, passed through her expression. Then, as silently as she had entered, she was gone. Nora stared at the porridge. Her stomach growled, but a knot of fear prevented her from eating. Where am I? What do they want with us? The stories she'd heard as a child came rushing back, tales of savage warriors, of captives and raids. Yet, the quiet dignity of the old woman, the life-giving warmth of the lodge, the simple offering of food, none of it fit the brutal narratives. Later, the flap opened again. It was him, the warrior, Kiyani. He filled the doorway, his presence immense, seeming to suck the very air from the small space. His expression was as unreadable as ever. He carried a small, skinned rabbit, its pink flesh a stark contrast to his dark hands. He walked to the fire pit and laid it beside the now cool porridge, a clear and simple message. Eat. Get strong. Stay away from them. Nora's voice was a hoarse croak, but it held a surprising strength. Don't you touch them. Sevens. Kiyani's eyes finally met hers. They were like dark flint, hard and capable of striking a spark. The children need a mother, he said, his English thick with the accent of his own tongue, the words carefully chosen. Not a ghost. He turned to leave, but his words hung in the air, a statement of fact, not a threat. She was a stranger here, an intruder, her life and the lives of her sons hanging by the thinnest of threads, his inexplicable decision to let them live. Outside, the camp was a world of quiet industry. Women scraped hides, men mended tools, and children played games with stones, their laughter echoing in the crisp air. But as Kiyani emerged from the lodge, a silence fell. All eyes turned to him, and then to the lodge that now housed the white woman. A warrior, younger and built with the lean, predatory grace of a hawk, stepped forward to block his path. It was Chaitan. You bring a viper into our home. Kiyani, Chaitan said, his voice low and laced with contempt. Her kind burned your past. Will you let her poison our future? I brought 2 children who were freezing to death, Kiyani retorted, his voice calm but with an undercurrent of steel. The woman was with them. That is all. That is never all, Chaitan shot back, his hand gesturing toward the lodge. She is a seed. and from seeds like her, the bitterest trees grow. The council will hear of this. Your father will hear of this. You have broken your vow. You shame your own scars. Chaitin's eyes burned with the fire of a zealot, a man who saw the world in the stark colors of blood and betrayal. He saw Nora not as a person, but as a symbol of every wrong ever done to his people. And in his eyes, Kiyani's act of mercy was an act of treason. The next few days passed in a haze of fear and isolation for Nora. She remained within the confines of the lodge, a self-imposed prison. Tiva came twice a day, bringing food and fresh water, her silence a constant, unnerving presence. She would sometimes watch Nora tend to the twins, her gaze intense, as if she were measuring Nora's worth in the quiet, maternal moments. Nora tried to speak to her once. "Thank you," she'd whispered as Tiva set down a bowl of stew. The old woman had simply paused, given a slow, deliberate nod, and left. It was neither acceptance nor rejection, but merely an acknowledgement. Nora felt like a ghost, an invisible entity in a world teeming with life just beyond the hide walls. She could hear the language of the camp, the cadence of voices rising and falling, the laughter of children, the rhythmic thud of an axe splitting wood. It was the sound of a community, a family, and she was utterly, terrifyingly outside of it. Her world was the small, fire-lit lodge and the two tiny lives that depended on her. She poured all her energy, all her love, into Samuel and Nathaniel. She sang them the lullabies her own mother had sung to her, her voice soft and shaky in the quiet of the teepee. They were her anchor, the only reason the crushing loneliness didn't swallow her whole. The fear was a constant companion, a cold knot in her stomach. Every time the flap was pushed aside, she tensed, expecting a knife, a threat, a final verdict. One afternoon, driven by a desperate need for fresh air, she wrapped the boys tightly and stepped outside for the first time. The sun was bright on the snow, and the air was sharp and clean. The effect was instantaneous. The camp fell silent. The work stopped. The children's laughter died. Every eye turned to her. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket of suspicion. She saw women pull their children closer, saw the warriors' hands drift toward their weapons. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but she lifted her chin, refusing to show the terror that threatened to buckle her knees. She took a few hesitant steps, her gaze fixed on the distant, snow-capped mountains, pretending she didn't feel the burn of their stares. Chaitin chose that moment to make his move. He strode across the clearing, deliberately placing himself in her path. He didn't speak to her, but to the others, his voice loud enough for all to hear. "The spirits of the snow are angry," he declared, his arm sweeping to indicate her. "They sent this ghost to test us, to see if we have forgotten the blood that was spilled on our land." He turned his venomous glare on Nora. "You are a bad omen. Your presence here invites sorrow." Sevens. Before Nora could react, Kiyani was there. He moved from the edge of the camp with a speed that was startling, placing himself between her and Chaitin. The two men faced each other, a stark contrast in ideologies. Kiyani, the pragmatist haunted by his past; Chaitin, the purist blinded by it. "She is under my protection," Kiyani stated, his voice dangerously low. "Your protection?" Chaitin scoffed. "Or your weakness? The tribe is not a shelter for your sentimentality. The chief will not allow this. You are one man, Kiyani. You cannot stand against the will of the people." He was right, and the murmur of agreement that rippled through the onlookers confirmed it. Kiyani's authority, even as the chief's son, was not absolute. He had spent years building a reputation as a fierce, unwavering protector of his people. That reputation was now cracking under the weight of his decision. He had saved 3 lives, but in doing so, he may have damned himself and them. As Nora stood there, clutching her babies, she understood. She was not a guest. She was a test, a division, a walking, breathing conflict that threatened to tear the fabric of this tight-knit world apart. And Kiyani, her reluctant savior, was standing in the epicenter of the storm she had brought with her. Part 3. The Scars We Carry. The cold snap that followed was brutal, even for the seasoned Comanche. A biting wind swept down from the northern peaks, and a sickness came with it, settling in the chests of the very young and the very old. It started as a cough, then blossomed into a burning fever. Within a week, the camp was filled with the sounds of rasping breaths and worried murmurs. And the sickness found its way into Kiyani's lodge. It was Samuel who fell ill first. His skin grew hot to the touch, his cries becoming weak and pained. A terrifying red rash bloomed across his pale cheeks. Nora's blood ran cold. She did everything she knew, using cool cloths to try and bring the fever down, rocking him endlessly, humming lullabies until her throat was raw. But the fever only climbed. Panic, a frantic and desperate thing, began to claw at her. She had survived Jedediah. She had survived the blizzard. She had birthed her sons in the frozen wilderness. She would not lose one of them now to a fever in the dark. Tiva appeared at the doorway, her silhouette framed by the gray afternoon light. She entered without being asked, carrying a small leather pouch. She looked at the feverish child, then at Nora's distraught face. For the first time, Nora saw a softness in the old woman's eyes, a flicker of shared grief, of a sorrow that only a mother who has feared for her child can know. Tiva knelt and began to work, her gnarled hands surprisingly nimble. She ground herbs into a paste, her movements steeped in the knowledge of generations. She mixed them with snowmelt and gently coaxed a few drops of the bitter liquid between Samuel's lips. She showed Nora how to brew a fragrant tea from cedar bark to help his breathing. For 2 days, they kept vigil together, 2 women from different worlds united by the universal language of a mother's fear. Meanwhile, Chayton saw the child's sickness not as a tragedy, but as an opportunity. He moved through the camp like a grim prophet, his voice a venomous whisper. "I warned you," he told the other families whose children were also sick. "The outsiders bring a white man's disease. Their very breath is poison to us. Kiyani's weakness has brought this curse upon our children." Fear is a powerful poison, and Chayton's words found fertile ground. The tribe's suspicion of Nora curdled into open resentment. The stares became glares. A thrown stone clattered against the hide of her lodge one night, a clear act of aggression. Kiyani stood guard outside, a solitary figure against the growing tide of hostility, his presence a silent declaration. But even he could not stop the fear. He was losing the support of his people. The warriors who once followed him without question now looked at him with doubt in their eyes. The council of elders summoned him, their faces grim. His father, the chief, a man of immense authority and quiet strength, listened to Chayton's accusations. He listened as other fathers spoke of their sick children, their voices thick with fear and anger. Kiyani stood before them, resolute. "The sickness is in the wind," not in the woman, he argued, his voice ringing with conviction. It comes every few winters. To blame her is to let fear make us foolish. But his logic was no match for their terror. The pressure on him, and on his father, was immense. The very stability of the tribe was being threatened by the presence of one woman and her 2 small children. Nora, inside the lodge, could feel the tension radiating through the camp. She knew she was the cause. She was a disease, a lightning rod for all their fear and hatred, and she had dragged Kiyani down with her. The fever finally broke on the 3rd night. Samuel's small body, drenched in sweat, began to cool. His breathing eased, and he fell into a deep, healing sleep. Nora wept with relief, her forehead pressed against his, her body trembling with the release of days of pent-up terror. Tiva placed a steadying hand on her shoulder, a silent gesture of communion. When Nora looked up, her eyes full of gratitude, the old woman simply nodded and slipped away, her duty done. Later that night, Kiyani entered the lodge. The weight of the council meeting was heavy on his shoulders. He looked exhausted, the lines around his eyes deeper than Nora had ever seen them. He sat by the fire, not speaking, staring into the flames as if searching for an answer in their dancing light. The silence between them was different this time. It wasn't filled with fear or uncertainty, but with a shared weariness. "They blame me for the sickness," Nora said softly. It wasn't a question. Kiyani didn't deny it. "Fear needs a face," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Today, it is yours. And you? They blame you, too." He finally looked at her, and in his eyes, she saw the full extent of his burden. But she also saw something else, a deep, unyielding sorrow. "Why?" she asked, the question coming from a place deeper than curiosity. "Why are you doing this? Risking everything for us?" Kiyani was silent for a long time. The fire crackled, casting shifting shadows on the walls of the lodge. When he spoke, his voice was raw with a pain that time had not healed. "When I was a boy," he began, his gaze distant, "the bluecoats came. They said we were on their land. Land my people had lived on for 1,000 moons. He traced the scar on his face with one finger. "They came with fire. I watched my mother. I tried to pull my little brother from our lodge, but the roof fell." His voice broke, just for a second. "I made a vow on their ashes. I swore I would watch this world of white men burn. I would never help one. I would never show mercy." He looked at his own hands, clenching them into fists. "I broke that vow for your sons." The raw honesty of his confession shattered the last of Nora's defenses. For the first time, she saw not a warrior, not a savior or a captor, but a man drowning in his own grief. His scars were on the outside, but she knew his deepest wounds were on the inside, just like hers. And in that moment of shared vulnerability, she found her own voice. "My husband, Jacob. He was a good man, but weak," she began, the words tasting like rust. "His brother, Jedediah, was strong and cruel. After Jacob died, Jedediah said he would care for us, but he saw me as his property, the babies as his lineage, the silver map as his birthright." She took a shuddering breath. "He wanted to own my future. I chose to run. I chose my sons over his cage." Their stories, born of different worlds, were laced with the same threads of fire, loss, and betrayal. They were both survivors of a brutal world that had tried to break them. This was the turning point. Nora looked from the sleeping faces of her children to the haunted eyes of the man who had saved them. A fierce, powerful resolve solidified within her. She was tired of being a victim. She was tired of being a burden. She would not be the weakness that broke this man. She would be his strength. She would not be the ghost Chayton accused her of being. She would prove she had a spirit of fire. The next morning, when the chief, Kiyani's father, came to the lodge, his face grave, she was ready. "The council has decided," the old chief said, his voice heavy. "Our people are divided. Your presence here is a wound that will not close." Before Kiyani could speak, Nora stepped forward, her back straight, her voice clear and steady. "Then let me prove I am not poison. Let me prove my worth. Is there not a test? A way for an outsider to earn her place?" The chief looked surprised, then a flicker of respect entered his eyes. He glanced at his son, then back at Nora. "There is a trial," he said slowly. "The test of the spirit. 3 days, alone, in the Whisperwind Canyons. You survive. You find your own food, your own water, your own way back. No one has ever asked to take it. It is usually a punishment." "I am not asking," Nora said, her gaze unwavering. "I am accepting." Part 4. A test of fire and spirit. The morning of the trial dawned cold and clear. A solemn quiet hung over the camp as Nora was led to the edge of the territory, to the maw of the Whisperwind Canyons. The entire tribe had gathered, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity, grim satisfaction, and, in a few, a newfound respect. Nora's hair was tied back with a simple leather thong. She wore a durable deerskin tunic Tiva had given her, practical and unadorned. Her only provisions were a single water skin and a flint knife. She clutched the knife, its handle smooth and cool against her clammy palm. It felt impossibly small against the vast, menacing landscape before her. She saw her sons in Tiva's arms, their small faces serene in sleep, oblivious to the fact that their mother was walking toward a possible death. The sight of them was a spike of pain and a surge of strength all at once. For them. Everything is for them. Kiyani stood with his father, his face an unreadable mask of stone, but Nora could feel the turmoil radiating from him. His hands were clenched at his sides, the knuckles white. He was forbidden from interfering, from even offering a word of advice. He could only watch her walk away. Chayton stood nearby, a smug, knowing look on his face. He made no secret of his belief that the canyons would swallow her whole, solving his problem for him. Before she crossed the invisible line that marked the beginning of her trial, Tiva stepped forward. She did not offer words of comfort. She simply pointed a gnarled finger toward a dusty green shrub with thick, fleshy leaves. "This one holds water in its heart," she said, her voice raspy. Then she gestured to a nearly identical plant a few feet away, this one with slightly narrower leaves. "This one holds a sleep from which you do not wake. The spirits of the canyon will know which you choose." That was all. A lesson and a warning, intertwined. Nora gave one last, lingering look at her sons, then turned and walked into the canyon without looking back. The moment she was out of sight of the camp, the sheer scale of her task crashed down upon her. The canyon walls rose like ancient, silent gods, their red and ochre faces carved by millennia of wind. The air was thin and dry, and the sun beat down with a relentless intensity. The first day was a lesson in humility. Thirst became her constant companion, a dry, rasping agony in her throat. She remembered Tiva's words, studying every shrub, her heart pounding with the fear of making a fatal mistake. She finally found the correct plant, crushing its leaves to release a few precious, bitter drops of moisture. It wasn't enough, but it was life. Hunger was a dull ache that grew sharper as the day wore on. She saw lizards skittering over rocks and birds soaring high above, all impossibly out of reach. She tried to set a simple snare with a strip of leather from her tunic, but the animal she hoped to catch was far cleverer than she. She failed. As dusk fell, a deep, chilling cold descended into the canyon. The world, which had been a furnace by day, became an icebox. She found a small overhang, a shallow cave barely deep enough to shelter her from the wind. The night was alive with alien sounds, the yip of a distant coyote, the screech of a hunting owl, the unsettling whisper of the wind moving through the rock formations. Every shadow seemed to hold a predator. Fear was a physical presence, a cold hand gripping her heart. She huddled in the darkness, the flint knife clutched in her hand, and thought of the warmth of the lodge, the scent of her babies, the solid, protective presence of Kiyani. The memories were a torture and a comfort. She had never felt so alone. She wept, not loud, racking sobs, but silent, hot tears of fear and despair. She had been so confident, so defiant. But the wilderness did not care for defiance. It only cared about survival. And as she shivered through that first, endless night, she wasn't sure if she had what it took. The second dawn was a revelation. Nora awoke, not rested, but changed. The despair of the night had been burned away by the cold, leaving behind a hard, clear resolve. The wilderness had humbled her, and in doing so, it had taught her. She would not fight it, she would become a part of it. She began to move differently, not with the hurried, fearful energy of the first day, but with a slow, observant patience. She watched where the birds gathered and found a small, hidden spring of clean water bubbling up between two rocks. It was a miracle. She drank until her body ached, feeling strength and life flow back into her. She remembered watching Tiva dig for roots, the way she tested the soil. Nora began to look at the ground not as empty dirt, but as a hidden pantry. Her search yielded a handful of tough, starchy tubers that she gnawed on, their earthy taste the most delicious meal she had ever eaten. Her mind was sharp, her senses heightened. She learned the patterns of the wind, the subtle shifts in light that signaled the time of day. She started to see the canyon not as a prison, but as a complex, living world with its own rules and rhythms. Her fear of predators was replaced by a cautious respect. She was an intruder here, and she had to act like one. On the afternoon of the second day, a sudden, violent thunderstorm rolled in. Black clouds gathered and unleashed a torrent of rain. Scrambling for shelter, Nora slipped on a wet rock and tumbled into a narrow crevice, half hidden by a curtain of vines. It was a painful fall, but as she gathered her wits, she realized she had stumbled into a small, dry cave, a perfect shelter from the storm. And there, in the damp, protected earth at the back of the cave, she saw it. A cluster of gnarled, reddish roots, with a single, 5-petaled white flower blooming in the gloom. The sunheart root. She recognized it instantly. Just days ago, Tiva had been lamenting that their supply had run out. She had been grinding the last of it to make a poultice for a child in the camp, one of the others who had caught the fever. The old shaman who knew where to find it had passed into the spirit world last winter. Finding it was considered a blessing from the spirits. Nora's heart swelled. This was more than survival. This was a purpose. She carefully dug up the precious roots with her knife, wrapping them in a large leaf to protect them. She had found her own way. Her return journey on the third day was that of a different woman. She walked with a confident, steady stride, her tunic torn and her face smudged with dirt, but her eyes held a light that no one had seen before. When she emerged from the canyon mouth, the sentries shouted in disbelief. The camp gathered, their faces a sea of shock. She did not collapse. She did not beg. She walked straight through the crowd, which parted for her as if by magic, and stopped before the chief and the council of elders. Kiyani stood among them, his face stripped bare of its stoicism, revealing a raw, profound relief that took her breath away. Chaitan's jaw was slack with astonishment. Nora did not speak of her hardship. She did not boast of her survival. She simply knelt, opened the leafy bundle, and presented the sun-heart roots to the chief. "For the child of breaking dawn," she said, her voice clear and strong. "I believe he has a fever." A stunned silence fell over the camp, followed by a wave of murmurs. She had not only survived the test, she had brought back a gift, a healing. She had thought of the tribe, not just herself. In that moment, she was no longer the outsider. She had earned her place, not with words, but with fire and spirit. Part 5. Where Vultures Gather. Life in the camp transformed for Nora. The stares of suspicion were replaced by nods of respect. Chaitan avoided her, his pride clearly wounded, but the open hostility was gone, replaced by a grudging silence. The women began to include her in their daily tasks, teaching her how to scrape hides until they were supple and how to grind corn into fine meal. Tiva became her mentor, her silence now a comfortable one, filled with unspoken lessons. Nora learned the names of the plants, the stories of the stars, and the rhythm of a life governed by seasons, not clocks. Most importantly, she was allowed to be a mother in peace. She would watch Samuel and Nathaniel play with the other children, their laughter mingling under the vast Montana sky, and a profound sense of peace would settle in her heart. This was home. Her bond with Kiyani deepened in the quiet moments between the demands of daily life. It was a love that grew not in grand declarations, but in small, steady acts of care. The way he would leave a piece of perfectly roasted venison for her after a hunt. The way she would mend a tear in his buckskin shirt, her stitches small and neat. One evening, as they sat watching the boys sleep, he reached out and gently traced the faint scar on her temple, a remnant of Jedediah's cruelty. His touch was feather-light, but it sent a shockwave through her. He said nothing, but his eyes held a world of anger for the man who had hurt her, and a deep, protective tenderness for her. In that single, silent gesture, she felt more loved and cherished than she ever had in her life. This fragile peace was shattered on a hot, late summer afternoon. A sentry's cry from the high ridge echoed through the camp, a sound of alarm that sent everyone scrambling for weapons. Nora grabbed the boys, her heart instantly seizing with a familiar, cold dread. At the edge of their territory, a group of riders appeared, 5 of them, white men, and leading them, seated on a big, black stallion, was Jedediah Vance. He looked different, leaner, meaner, his eyes burning with a zealot's fire. They were not here to parley. Tied to their saddles were two young Comanche hunters who had been out tracking buffalo. They were alive, but bruised and bound. Jedediah held up a hand, a mocking gesture of peace. No need for bloodshed. He yelled, his voice carrying across the clearing. I'm just here for what's mine. One of his men rode forward and dropped a bloodied deerskin pouch in the dust. A message. Kiyani retrieved it, his face grim. He brought it to his father, the chief, who read the crude charcoal scrawl. The terms were simple and brutal. Jedediah wanted Nora and the family map she carried. He would trade the two hunters for her. If they refused, he would kill the hunters and his men. He claimed there were 20 more waiting in the hills, would burn the camp to the ground. He gave them until sunrise. The vultures had gathered. The idyllic peace was revealed to be nothing more than a brief illusion, a pause before the final, bloody act. The life Nora had fought so hard to build was about to be put to the sword. The ultimatum threw the camp into chaos. A hastily called council of elders convened in the chief's lodge, the air thick with tension and the smell of fear. The families of the two captured hunters wept openly, their grief a heavy weight on the proceedings. The tribe was split. To protect an outsider, should they sacrifice two of their own? And could they even survive an attack from a larger, better armed force? Chaitin, his voice strained but logical, argued for the trade. It is a bitter choice, he said, addressing the chief. But it is the choice of a leader. We must protect our own. 2 hunters for 1 woman. The math is cruel, but it is simple. Comanche blood is worth more than hers. His words found support. Many of the elders nodded in grim agreement. It was a pragmatic, if heartless, solution to a problem she had brought to their doorstep. Kiyani stood against them, his voice shaking with a controlled rage. "We do not trade lives," he thundered, his gaze sweeping over the council. "We do not bow to the threats of cowardly thieves." We gave her our protection. If that word means nothing, then we are no better than they are. We fight, but his was a call to honor that could cost them everything. War would mean death. It would mean widows and orphans. The chief, his face etched with the impossible weight of the decision, remained silent, caught between his son's honor and his people's survival. Nora, standing outside the lodge, heard it all. She heard the weeping, the angry arguments, the cold logic of her own sacrifice. A wave of despair washed over her. After everything she had endured, everything she had fought for, it would end like this. She would be handed over to Jedediah, a piece of property to be traded, and her sons would be left motherless. But then, the despair was replaced by a familiar, stubborn fire. The same fire that had helped her survive the blizzard, that had pushed her through the trial. She would not be a piece in someone else's game. She would write the ending to her own story. She pushed aside the hide flap and strode into the center of the council. A collective gasp went through the lodge. A woman, an outsider, had never before dared to interrupt the elders. But Nora's face held such authority, such fierce determination, that no one stopped her. "You will not trade for me," she said, her voice ringing in the sudden silence. "And you will not die for me. We will do neither. We will set a trap." All eyes were on her. "Jedediah wants a map," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "He is blinded by greed. He believes it is sewn into my son's blanket. We will give him what he wants." She looked directly at Kiyani, then at the chief. "I will go to him. I will give him a map, a false one. A map that leads him not to a silver mine, but to the heart of the Whisperwind Canyons. To the place you call the Serpent's Tooth, where the path is narrow and there is no escape." A stunned silence filled the lodge. The sheer audacity of the plan was breathtaking. She was offering herself as bait. "It's too dangerous," Kiyani protested immediately. "It is less dangerous than a war we might not win," Nora countered, turning to him. "He will be expecting an attack. He will not be expecting me to walk right up to him. His arrogance is his weakness. I survived those canyons once. I know their secrets. It's the one place where we have the advantage." The chief stared at her, a look of profound respect dawning on his face. He saw not a frightened white woman, but a strategist, a warrior as fierce as any man in the lodge. He looked at Chaitin, whose face was a mask of disbelief and dawning admiration. "The woman has the heart of a Comanche," the chief declared, his voice booming. The decision was made. Chaitin, for the first time, looked at Nora and gave a slow, deliberate nod. An alliance was forged in that moment, not of necessity, but of mutual respect. They would not fight a defensive war. They would hunt. And Nora, the woman they once called a ghost, would be the lure. Part 6. Home on the unclaimed land. The plan was set in motion as the first hint of dawn painted the eastern sky pink. Nora, her face a mask of feigned terror, rode out alone on a borrowed mare. She clutched a decoy baby blanket in her arms, the crudely drawn map tucked within its folds. Kiyani, Chaitin, and 50 warriors had already slipped away in the pre-dawn darkness, melting into the landscape, circling around to take their positions in the high, hidden ridges of the Whisperwind Canyons. Every instinct in Nora's body screamed at her to turn back, but the image of her son's faces, asleep in Tiva's care, propelled her forward. As she approached Jedediah's camp, his men immediately surrounded her, rifles leveled. Jedediah emerged from his tent, a triumphant, cruel smirk spreading across his face. "I knew you'd see reason," he gloated, his eyes devouring the blanket in her arms. "Get off the horse." She complied, her movements deliberately shaky. She played the part of the broken, terrified woman to perfection. "The hunters," she said, her voice trembling. "Let them go, and it's yours." Jedediah laughed. "Of course. A deal's a deal." He gestured, and his men cut the 2 Comanche hunters free. They scrambled away, disappearing back toward their own territory. Jedediah snatched the blanket from her, his greedy fingers tearing at the seams until he found the deerskin map. He unrolled it, his eyes gleaming as he traced the path to the imaginary silver mine. "The Serpent's Tooth," he read aloud. "Sounds promising." He shoved the map into his coat. "All right, boys. Looks like our luck has changed. Let's ride." Nora's heart pounded as she was forced onto a horse and led away, a captive at the center of the outlaw gang. They rode hard, Jedediah's arrogance making him reckless. He was so sure of his victory, so blinded by the promise of wealth, that he ignored the telltale signs of danger, the unnatural silence of the canyons, the absence of wildlife. He led his men deeper and deeper into the winding, narrow passages. Nora knew this place. She recognized the rock where she had found water, the overhang where she had sheltered from the storm. She was on her own ground now. As they rounded a sharp bend into the tightest part of the canyon, the serpent's tooth, a war cry, sharp and piercing, echoed from the cliffs above. It was the signal. The trap was sprung. Arrows rained down from the ridges, silent and deadly. Men screamed and fell from their saddles. The outlaws, caught in the open with nowhere to run, panicked, firing their rifles wildly at the unseen enemy. It was a slaughter. Amid the chaos, Kiyani dropped from a ledge, landing silently behind Jedediah and pulling him from his horse. The two men crashed to the ground, locked in a brutal struggle. At the same time, Chayton led a charge from the mouth of the canyon, cutting off any escape. For the first time, Nora saw him and Kiyani fighting not as rivals, but as brothers, their movements synchronized, their purpose unified. While the battle raged, Jedediah managed to throw Kiyani off and scramble for his gun. But before he could aim, Nora was there. She stood before him, not with a weapon, but with the full, unbridled force of her will. "There is no silver, Jedediah," she said, her voice cutting through the sounds of battle. "There is no map. There is nothing. Just your own empty, pathetic greed." His face contorted in disbelief, then rage. He raised his pistol to fire at her, but in that moment of hesitation, an arrow sprouted from his shoulder. He staggered back, looking up at the cliffs where Kiyani now stood, bow in hand. Jedediah collapsed in the dust, defeated not just by the warrior's strength, but by the woman he had underestimated, the woman who had used his own avarice to destroy him. The aftermath of the battle was quiet and swift. The few remaining outlaws surrendered, their fight broken. Jedediah, clutching his wounded shoulder, was bound and taken away, his fate to be decided by the council. The Comanche warriors descended from the cliffs, their faces grim but victorious. They had defended their own, and not a single one of their own had been lost. As Kiyani walked toward Nora, the other warriors parted for him. He stopped before her, his eyes searching her face for any sign of injury. He reached out and brushed a stray lock of hair from her cheek, his touch exquisitely gentle. No words were needed. Everything was conveyed in that look: relief, pride, a love that had been forged and tested in the fiercest of fires. Their return to the camp was triumphant. The tribe poured out to meet them, the air filled with joyous cries and songs of victory. The two rescued hunters were reunited with their weeping families. That evening, a great celebration was held. As the fire roared and the drums beat, Chayton approached Nora and Kiyani. He stood before Nora and gave the Comanche sign of utmost respect, a closed fist over his heart. "You have the spirit of a warrior and the wisdom of a chief," he said, his voice clear for all to hear. "I was wrong. You are one of us." It was a public declaration, a mending of the rift she had inadvertently caused. The past was buried, and the tribe was whole again, stronger and more unified than before. In the weeks that followed, a new sense of peace settled over the land. It was not the fragile, uncertain peace of before, but something solid and enduring. Kiyani, with the help of his friends, began to build a new lodge. It stood on a small rise overlooking the river, slightly apart from the main camp, but still a part of it. Nora worked alongside him. She learned to mix mud and grass to seal the hide walls, to weave reed mats for the floor. They worked in a comfortable silence, their movements a dance of two people who understood each other perfectly. Their hands would brush, and a jolt of warmth would pass between them. It was in these small moments that their future was being built. Tiva came to bless their new home, burning sage and whispering ancient prayers for prosperity, health, and happiness. She placed Samuel and Nathaniel into their new cradle inside the lodge, a symbolic gesture of their belonging. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Nora and Kiyani stood at the entrance to their new home. The boys were asleep inside, safe and loved. The sounds of the camp were a gentle murmur in the distance. "I used to think a home was a place with 4 walls and a roof," Nora said softly, her gaze on the vast, beautiful land before them. "A place you were born into. What is it now?" Kiyani asked, his arm wrapping around her shoulders, pulling her close. She leaned her head against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart. "It's a choice," she whispered. "It's a person. I never chose where I came from, or the pain I endured. But I choose this. I choose this land, these children." She turned her face up to his, her eyes shining in the twilight. "And I choose you, Kiyani." He looked down at her, his dark eyes softer than she had ever seen them. A slow smile touched his lips. "And I choose you, Eleonora," he said, speaking her full name for the first time. "You are not a vow I broke. You are the place my spirit has come to rest." He lowered his head and kissed her, a kiss that held no desperation or uncertainty, only the quiet, powerful promise of 1,000 sunrises to come. They were not Comanche or white, survivor or savior. They were simply a family, standing on the edge of the wild, in a home they had built on a piece of unclaimed land. In the heart of the Wild West, a world carved by violence and defined by blood, our story finds its end. But it is not an end of survival. It is a beginning of life. Eleonora and Kiyani teach us a profound truth. Family is not the blood you are born with, but the people you choose to bleed for. Their love was not found in a whispered promise, but forged in the crucible of a blizzard, tested by suspicion, and solidified in the face of death. They learned that the deepest scars are not the ones we can see, but they can be healed by a love brave enough to look past them. They built more than a lodge. They built a home on the common ground of respect, courage, and a choice. The choice to see a human being instead of an enemy. Their story reminds us that even in the harshest of lands, in the most divided of times, the most resilient thing that can grow is hope. If their journey has stirred something in your soul, if you believe in a love that chooses, that fights, that builds, then you belong here. Subscribe to Wild West Love Stories, share this tale, and let us know in the comments what it means to truly find a home. Your next adventure is waiting.